Hello and welcome to the history of the Metacrisis. My guest today is as a controversial figure as it gets. Some call him a hero, others call him a troublemaker. For sure, he is a rebel, but not without a cause. He is a rebel with a very good cause, the Metacrisis, that is. Roger Hallam is a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, a global environmental movement known for its non-violent civil disobedience tactics to demand action on climate change. Hallam is recognized for his activism and advocacy for urgent measures to address the climate crisis, often emphasizing the need for disruptive protests to prompt governmental action. And he has also co-founded Just Stop Oil, a grassroots organization demanding to immediately abandon the use of fossil fuels. Further, he also created a political party, Beyond Politics, which describes itself as a political party within a distinct goal: to bring about a political revolution by replacing the British government with citizens' assemblies. These assemblies would address critical issues, including the climate crisis and other political matters. Further, let's say that Roger's background includes experiences in grassroots organizing, academia, and activism, which have shaped his approach to mobilizing people for social and environmental causes. He was born in the United Kingdom and studied at the universities of Oxford and got his Ph.D. from King's College London, where he focused on aspects of grassroots political organizing. And before he co-founded the Extinction Rebellion, he had been involved in various activist movements, including campaigns related to social justice, environmental issues, and anti-war efforts. He has written three books that are relevant to our discussion today: Common Sense for the 21st Century, Part 1 and Part 2. The first is about only non-violent rebellion can now stop climate breakdown and social collapse is the subtitle, while the second part is the Extinction Rebellion Handbook. And here, the third book that we could discuss today is about regenerative cultures, a guide to a thriving future. So without further ado, Roger, welcome to the history of the Metacrisis.
That's great. Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Where are you and what got you off the cliff to start all these rebellious actions of yours?
Well, I live in London most of the time. What you didn't mention is I was a farmer for 20 years in Wales, which is on the west side of the UK. And what got me into the climate situation specifically, I suppose, was being a farmer. And like many of the farmers around the world and the farmers in Greece, for instance, you don't need to be a genius to work out that the climate is making massive changes, and it's extremely difficult to predict whether you're going to have, the hottest year, cold spells, weeks of rain, droughts. And on my farm in Wales, we had 7 weeks of rain, about 2007, 2008, I think. And then it was -15, which is unknown in that part of the world. So, both things led to me losing all my crops. And so, to cut a long story short, that led me to the realization that the climate crisis is not a problem or even a cause. It's a meta-crisis, as you say, in the sense that it is absolutely fundamental to the maintenance of civilization, to social life, to political life, because if we can't grow food and if we can't control the climate, then that's the end of our organized way of life.
However, you were educated in elite class schools, Oxford, King's College, and you are now fighting the elites. You are the most rebellious person I know in Europe against the elites, against capitalism, against the capitalistic society, and you are actually advocating for a grassroots development of new kinds of democracy. How did you develop these concepts in your mind, and what got you starting with organizing social movements like Just Stop Oil, like Extinction Rebellion? What got you starting? What got you, what pushed you?
Well, just to correct you, I didn't go to Oxford University. I went to the London School of Economics when I was young.
LSE, right.
And then I went to King's College, which is another sort of London university over the way, as it were, sort of next to LSE, for 5 years doing research into social movement development and how to mobilize people effectively and what have you. And I've always been interested in social change since I was a teenager. I was involved in the peace movement in the 1980s and in housing cooperatives and workers' cooperatives, the social economy, as you might say, during my 20s, and then in organic farming. So I've always been interested in the possibility of creating a better society, as you might say. I think what I realized, and I realized this quite early on, that if you're serious about social change, then you can't just talk about it and make general abstract, analyses. You need to study how people change, the psychology of change and the sociology of change. And that's what I studied at King's College. I'd got lots of experience, obviously, as being an organizer before that, but I wanted to do a systematic study of those details. And by that, I don't mean, broad brush stuff. I mean, one of my jokes is, it all depends where you put the biscuits on the table when you have a meeting. You see what I mean?
That's true.
It depends whether someone talks to you within 15 seconds of entering the room. It depends on the extent to which people can engage in the act of speech when they are in a meeting. So what we did, myself and a number of other people, is evolve a method of mobilization which has been extremely successful in creating some of the largest climate campaigns and social movements of the last 10 years. And I now do podcasts called Designing the Revolution, which you can find on, various social media. And I do Zoom calls. I did one last night on designing the revolution in the 21st century. And what I'm interested in communicating is not just that if we don't do something dramatic, we'll lose everything that progressive forces have worked towards for the last, 200-300 years since the French and Greek revolutions, as you might say, right? This has been a long tradition of people believing they can create a better world where people are respected and people have rights and people have self-determination. But all of that is now going to be lost in the next 20 years because we're going to lose the ability, as I say, to grow food. So where am I up to? Yeah, so what I do is advise people on how to start campaigns. And I'm very interested in speaking to people in Greece about why there isn't a mass movement in Greece like there is, starting in Italy with Last Generation, for instance, Ultimate Generation, I think it's called, Generation. And obviously, there's similar things in Spain. In other words, like the areas around the Mediterranean should be in full-scale mobilization because, to be blunt, please don't take offense if there's Greek listeners on this, but it's going to be the end of Greece. People are going to have to emigrate north, and you can look at European history to know what happens when mass migration happens. It's not pretty. So it's all hands on deck, dare I say it. Yeah.
So your message is actually apocalyptic. You really transmit a message. I have seen several of your interviews and public discussions. You really believe that we are going to extinction. And that's why you called your own movement Extinction Rebellion. When it comes to Greece, I assure you, movements like this are coming. I also foresee them for the immediate future because the political system is collapsing. I see that abstention is becoming more massive and more massive each day. The young people do not engage in politics with the traditional methods as long as they see that they cannot change things. Real change, real political change does not come through the political parties anymore. We have new political parties, maybe, I don't know, every 3 or 6 months here in Greece. But after the collapse of the economic system back in 2008, 2010, people are really disappointed with politics. Once we have had a referendum saying no to the memoranda of the neoliberal order, and then after voting for no with a mass majority, the government actually developed the yes approach. So,
I know. I read your ex-finance minister's book when I was in prison.
Yeah. I also want to talk about your prison experience. How was it for a free person like you to be behind jail, to be behind the bars?
Well, I've been to prison 6 times in my life, so it's not an unusual experience for me. That said, the last time I went to prison was for 4 months, and I made a speech in Britain calling for civil disobedience. So I was arrested for doing a speech, and obviously, you know, the UK has a reputation for being a fairly liberal country, but this has changed significantly over the last 2 or 3 years due to this new movement of civil disobedience, and hundreds of people have been put into prison. Literally thousands of people have been arrested, and they're put into prison without trial, you know, before there's a trial happening, because it's a political move to stop people from organizing. So the UK has rapidly become a semi-authoritarian country, and it's very difficult to organize civil disobedience in the UK for that reason. But you know, personally, as any revolutionary, I just see going to prison as an inevitable consequence of being in resistance to a regime that's going to destroy everything that I believe in. So there's no choice but to act. And if that results in prison, as people in Greece know, right, you know, this is part of the process of political change. It doesn't come through people voting, it comes through people resisting, and prison is part of that tradition, as you might say. So there's a big there's a big change in the political culture in the UK, and I would
all around the West, I would say freedom of speech suffers all around the West.
Yes, absolutely. But what's particularly interesting in Britain, just to continue this theme, is that because we have a first past the post system, it's very difficult for new political forces to gain any traction. And so there's an enormous disillusionment with politics, more than at any time, you know, in the last 100 years. Something like 90% of the British people don't agree with the constitutional arrangements in some way. And I think 30 or 40% of people want a completely different system. And this is not unusual, of course, as you say, you know, it's happening across the Western world. And because people are being shown a progressive alternative to the neoliberal system, then they're being forced into the radical right and fascistic tendencies. And this is a massive, massive problem. And what I'm trying to do is to broaden out the climate crisis issue into a systematic critique of neoliberalism as the core reason why we're going to hell, namely that capitalism is incapable of controlling itself because of the profit motive. Everyone is trying to externalize the costs of their business activities, and there's no cost to destroying the environment. And so we have this, massive collective action problem, as they say in academia, which is, well, I don't care because I'm just making my money. So there has to be a revolution that controls and removes capitalism, and there needs to be some sort of pro-social alternative, which is something based around what I think many people in Greece have experimented with, which is an assembly form of decision making. And obviously this goes back, dare I say it, to ancient Greece and Athens, doesn't it? So we're not talking about anything, totally new here. But what we're working on in the UK is to have assemblies which discuss what is going wrong and what needs to be done, and then delegates from those assemblies or people selected by chance, by sortition, like in ancient Greece, in ancient Athens. These people are selected by sortition, by chance, and they go to a national assembly. And then the National Assembly says what the people really want because they're representative of the ordinary people. Then they haven't been selected by the rich. They haven't gone through a party political process. And then they can come out with a program that can be used to create mass protest and civil disobedience. And
what do you see? What do you get as a feedback from the citizenry?
Sorry?
What do you get as a feedback from the people, from ordinary people, in your plans, in your strategies? Do they participate? Do they take action?
No, I think it's very difficult for people to participate around the climate. And this is one of the problems of framing the problem around the climate, which is the climate as a phrase was promoted by the corporate public relations of American fossil fuel companies 30 years ago. And it was a disastrous frame because it makes people think about the tool of destruction rather than the destroyer who uses the tool. So, as I said at a talk the other day, we don't talk about, the concentration camps killing the Jews. We talk about the Nazis killing the Jews, right? The method was the concentration camps. Similarly, with the global ruling class now, they intend to have billions of people die in order to hold on to their fossil fuel-based power. That's the problem. It's not the mechanism of death. It doesn't matter whether they shoot people or gas them or destroy their climate. They're still killing people. And this was said by one of the leaders of the small island states, that if you're going to continue this massive carbon economy, then you might as well come over and bomb us, drop bombs on our islands, because the effect is the same. You're still leading to the destruction of our countries and culture and our livelihoods. So, so I think the smart strategy moving forward, as you yourself have said, is to center things around a meta crisis, which is a crisis of capitalism, a crisis of democracy, and the outcome of that is the climate crisis. And once we frame things like that, then it's where the strong social resistance traditions, like in Greece, can start to mobilize around the social crisis, which is also the ecological crisis. And the ecological crisis is the social crisis. So, for instance, I work with people in Italy where there's been, 4 or 5 major ecological disasters last year. You've got the olives, you've got the drought in the Po Valley, got massive rain around Bologna in central Italy, isn't it? Over 48 degrees in Sicily, the loss of the orange crops, right? These crises don't happen in isolation to the capitalist sort of corrupt governmental system. And people don't complain about the climate crisis. What they're complaining about is the corruption of the government that refuses to give them compensation for their flooded houses, refuses to help them, or the money goes missing, and all the rest of it. So when we campaign, we need to campaign on the basis of corruption, on the basis of social inequality. And the climate crisis needs to be integrated into that critique and into that mobilization strategy, as you might say. And the mechanism of creating that mobilization is the assembly. So you go to an area of Italy and say, look, you're all fucked. You know you are. So let's all get together and talk about it. What's going wrong? So I have a friend in Australia where he works in communities that have been flooded 3 times in the last 2 years, I think. Their houses are destroyed. Their houses are still destroyed a year later. So they're having assemblies and saying, this government doesn't care about us. We need to take direct action. We need to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people and say it's the rich that need to pay. It's not us, who have done nothing wrong. And this is the big message for the next 10 years. And if we don't get this message communicated effectively to ordinary people, then they will be manipulated by fascistic forces that say it's nothing to do with climate, it's to do with the urban university educated class that are telling us what to do. It's a myth. Climate change doesn't exist. There's nothing more disgustingly irrational than to tell ordinary people that they can just burn, baby, burn. That there's nothing more evil than to tell people that it's fine, even though it's not fine, because they're being led to an eternal hell.
I totally agree with you. However, what I see is that even introducing to this discussion about the metacrisis, not at the general public, even in my house, even in my family, it's so difficult and it's so overwhelming for the members of my family that they don't want to discuss it.
Yes.
Most people are afraid to even touch the subject. What I get as a response from my environment is, okay, we understand. We have seen this year, I don't know, in December, we have had 22 to 25 degrees in Greece. I've been on the beach. Well, usually we had snow in Christmas time. But this year we were on the beach. Everybody sensed it. Everybody really senses climate change right now. Most people dealing with science on the subject are quite specific. James Hansen has said that the rise of temperature is actually in the pipeline. No matter what we're going to do, if we're not going to engage in drastic measures of dealing with the damage that we have already done, the rise of temperature and the rise of the seas, and it's in the pipeline. It will happen. People understand that. What people cannot find their answer to is, how am I going to live my ordinary life? How am I going to pay for the bills of my telephone, of my children's education? How am I going to eat tomorrow? Not in 10 years' time. And to this, as long as society doesn't provide with an answer, they are in a deadlock, in a dead end.
Yes, well, as I said, I spent 5 years doing a systematic study of how people mobilize and how to get people to mobilize. And it's important to challenge our conceptualization of how we think about the individual and how we think about society, and to realize that we've been taught to think about the individual as an isolated entity in society that makes decisions separate from society on the basis of rationality and information. And this notion of the individual is actually historically situated in the post-Enlightenment period, which produced both Marxism and capitalism, because both of these modes of looking at people ignore the sociability through which people form their opinions. And what I mean by that is the concept of the individual is a social construction. it didn't exist before the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, people conceived of themselves in a community. They existed for the community, they were formed by the community, and the individual as a concept did not exist. And obviously they, also exist in a divine cosmos, where God was the actor and various other things. Now, I'm not saying like the concept of the individual is necessarily wrong or right, or the concept of community is necessarily wrong or right. But we need to have a sophisticated understanding that concepts are not reality. They're interpretations of reality that we use in order to promote various ideologies. So we have to be careful to understand that the way we talk about things limits our imagination and limits our ability to conceive of new possibilities. And the essence, as I'm sure you'll agree, of the revolutionary orientation is to challenge our way of seeing who we are as humanity and what we're capable of. And that leads us to modern social research, which leads us to a post-individual conceptualization of the self. And this is empirically based. It's not ideological in the old sense of the word, in the sense that if you study as a social scientist, what individuals, in inverted commas, actually do is they're always looking at those around them. In other words, the unit of agency is not the individual, but the social space. In other words, whoever defines the social space, the forces that do that, whether they're capitalist forces or revolutionary forces, they produce the humanity that is looked upon as what humanity can be or not be. So this is a sophisticated point, right? And, it's taken a long time for radical scholars over the previous century or two to communicate this to people, that the way we talk defines our possibility. And what this concretely means is that when you're talking about your family members, for instance, your family members don't exist as family members. They exist in the social space of your family situation. What you say to them, what they hear in the newspapers, what they see on television, on social media, their different internal desires for security, how that gets manifested, through different strategies. In other words, it's a complex system. It's not, hey, they won't listen, right? That's they won't listen in a particular design context. So, for instance, as we know, those of us who design assemblies, people can enter an assembly with a cynical, negative, right-wing orientation. And during the assembly, through acting, through engaging in the act of speech, through listening to others who are similar to them, through discussion, can radically change their self-conception, literally in a matter of hours, from a conception of disempowerment, of limitation, to a self-conception of empowerment and possibility. And this well-established sociological process, psychological process, has been manifested throughout history. In other words, the individual is just a staging post. It's just an entity yet to be molded. Whether you're looking at television with a right-wing politician saying all you can think about is becoming rich, or in the context of sitting in an assembly and going, you and me are the same. We can create something different in Greece, right? That's not about the individual. It's about the design of the context. So I'm not saying...
I agree with you. We're social creatures, but we seem to have forgotten it.
We've forgotten it, and also we've been manipulated by the ideology of capitalism to limit ourselves to material beings that are only interested in their own self-interest. which is totally unempirical, right? Individuals can be selfish, but they can also be massively unselfish. As you see in war times or times of revolution or times of social crisis, people are capable of massive sacrifice when they believe that their identity requires them to engage in that sacrifice, and whether others around them are engaging in that sacrifice, obviously. So it all depends. And what the revolutionary has to do is the primary responsibility is to design the context through which people form their self-conception in combination with others. And the main mechanism of that is to bring people together in assemblies to discover their collective pro-social orientation, as you might say. I'll just give you a little example before we finish, but this is an important point because a lot of left-wing activists are very cynical, and that's because they're unwittingly replicating a capitalistic sociology, a capitalistic psychology. Oh, people aren't capable of rebelling. Oh, people aren't interested. Oh, people are only thinking about themselves. No, that's what people are like in the capitalist context. Take them out of that context, put them into a new context, and they'll become socialistic, right? So I'll give you a sort of example of a famous example of this process was in Ireland. As you may know, it's a Catholic country, and it has a very strong anti-abortion tradition coming out of Catholicism. And at the same time, modernity and the new generations want more freedom and human rights. So there's a massive cultural battle. When people went into an assembly, an extended process, people went into that assembly, hating gay people, hating, women that have an abortion, outrage, blah, blah, blah. And then through the process of mutual exploration, through listening, they gradually realize how appalling it is for women not to be able to have control over their bodies when they want to have an abortion, all the rest of it, right? So they come out and they say, I listened, I heard, I discussed, and now I've changed. And that had a massive influence upon Ireland. And they had a referendum, and there was an unbelievable change. 60-odd% of the population voted. Now, the issue here is not about abortion, right? The issue here is the context through which we form our identities and our opinions. And at the moment, as we all know, social media is dominated by the billionaire class and the interests of the billionaire class. And the assemblies can become a counterweight to that because it doesn't take money, doesn't take a lot of organization. There's a town in the UK called Hull. It's a small city, and they have assemblies like every 3 or 4 weeks, and 70, 100 people turn up to these assemblies, and they're from the neighborhood, and they go leafleting, they put up posters, they do local social media, and they say, look, things aren't going well. Come and talk about it. They give people a meal. There's a creche for the children. You see what I mean? These are the details of the revolutionary strategy. It's not good enough to say, oh, we'll have a revolution, we're going to bring down the state. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is what sort of soup are you going to serve on Thursday night? Is it nice?
Yes. And so there are so many things to discuss about what you just said. Let me just start by saying, yes, we have a lot of studies about the psychology of change and the psychology of being in agreement with our social environment. We have studies showing we have had in a room 10 persons, and the 8 were not the subjects of the experiment. The 2 were subjects of the experiment. So the 8, the room started smelling like a fire was on the making. So you had the smell of fog, of how do you say it? Of smoke.
Okay.
But the 8 people remained in their place, like they're smelling nothing. The 2 of them that were really smelling the smoke, just looked for social cues from the environment. And as long as the 8 people didn't move, they didn't move as well.
Yeah.
So they repeated the experiment, and this time the flames were also visible.
Yeah.
But the 8 persons were again instructed not to move. So the other 2 persons were seeing the flames and they were smelling the smoke. But again, because the 8 people didn't move, they didn't move.
Yeah.
We are so much social creatures that we don't really know how to not to be. And it is amazing for me that during this last 200 years, the great acceleration, we call it, people have become so individualized.
Yes. But it's important to understand that that's a social process. It's not a metaphysical reality.
Exactly.
It's a function of social design. It's a function of those 8 people going, I'm not doing anything. But that's the social construction. They're not born to do nothing. It's created through social processes. And, you know, we have a phrase in academia in the UK called pluralistic ignorance, which is exactly what you're saying, which is, I don't know other people are worried about their life as well. And so because I don't know, I assume it's just me.
Yeah.
And so you do nothing. While if through the assembly process, there's 2 elements. The first element is you realize the 100 people in your room are actually similar to you. You know, you have people tell each other about their children, about their life, about their struggles, so that people understand, oh, that person looks a little bit different. Maybe he's a migrant, maybe he's from a different social class, but everyone basically cares about the same stuff. So you create that connection and that trust. Then you talk about what's going wrong and what needs to go right. And then you realize that everyone in that assembly wants similar things. But that's only half the process, because then you're going to say, well, it's just this assembly, right? It's just the 2 people in the room who have smelt the smoke. What can we do? Everyone else is doing nothing. So you have to create 50 assemblies in Greece, right? In every town within 3 months. And then all those assemblies send people to a national assembly. Then the pluralistic ignorance, then the realization is there is a fire, because in that national assembly, which is publicized throughout the country, people can see, oh, it's people in northern Greece, it's people in central Greece, it's people on the islands. Everyone's thinking the same thing, which is the system is not working for us. And the climate crisis is going to destroy the country that we loved and fought for and died for, you know. And we can't betray the people who, you know, down the last 200 years have lived and died for Greece. It's a patriotic violation. You see what I mean? It's not some weird thing about in the environment. It's about saving our country. It's about saving our children. It's about saving our state. Well, once lots of people see it within that frame and lots of people see it together, then that's when you traditionally have the explosion, you know, of social change. And we know that because it's happened 100 times. You know, people don't do anything and then they realize that there is a fire all at once. And
you're talking about the social tipping points. And
yes, exactly.
The social tipping points, we have had some experiments saying that it is around 25% of the society.
Yes.
Yeah, but I have seen that you are starting with 3.5 as a target. Why is that?
It depends on what you define as mobilization, right? So often when it's social attitudes, you know, like being aggressive towards women, or attitudes to gay people, or, you know, divorce, you know, these sort of social issues, you're looking at 20, you know, between 10 and 30% of the population, depending on the issue and the level of social repression. Because, of course, a lot of people agree, but they don't want to act, right? So it depends on the issue, obviously, right? Not every issue is the same, but it's between 10 and 30%. So, for instance, you know, in China, people used to do foot binding, you know, with women, so their feet wouldn't grow, and it created an enormous amount of pain and suffering. Well, obviously, with the sort of Enlightenment ideas of human rights in the 1900s, people decided this was terrible, but it took like something like 50 years to get 10% of the Chinese population to change their ways. But once it got to 10%, it went to 90% in 10 years afterwards, because everyone felt released from the obligation to engage in cruelty, which was objectively the case. But when you're looking at revolutionary activity, this is the active engagement of going to the street, right? That's only 3.5%. And arguably it's as little as 1%. So for instance, in Tahrir Square, in the Egyptian revolution, which everyone knows about, everyone thinks, oh, the Egyptians, had a revolution. No, they didn't. Only 10% of the population of Cairo went to Tahrir Square, right? Or sorry, 5%. So there was 1 million people in Tahrir Square, but there was 20 million people in Cairo.
Yeah.
So the vast majority of people were watching soap operas and doing the washing up and just, being cynical.
Ordinary
right?
business as usual.
Business as usual, but that's irrelevant. You know that from your Greek experience, right? When the massive debt crisis hit, there were hundreds of thousands of people in Athens, but Athens is what, millions of people. What was everyone else doing? Well, just, on the beach.
Yeah.
But this is the exciting thing about the project of social transformation, is that you don't need to mobilize everyone. You need to have your 50 assemblies in Greece, let's say, and then you need a demonstration of 10 or 20,000 people. And then you split those thousands of people into small groups. You don't have them all in one big group, because when they sit together, they become more empowered and they can download stuff from social media, for instance. And then the big ask is to come back next Saturday and to bring 5 of their friends with them. And they make that commitment to the people around them in the small group. So it's more embedded. So it's not from the revolutionary leadership to the individual, right? It's from the revolutionary leadership to the small group that makes a commitment as a group in the same time and space. This is the critical element of how you create mobilization. It's a collective activity. It's not you're sitting in your room there ticking a box on social media, right? No one's going to feel courageous sitting in their living room. You feel courageous when you're subsumed into the courage of the crowd. And that's well established now. We've known of that for 200 years. But what we can do is use social media to actually facilitate people coming off social media. Paradoxically.
Yes, but then you have all this mass media right now, because social media are a part of mass media that are constantly bombarding people with irrelevant information, and there is an information overflow, and they are cultivating wrong images and wrong idols, and they are creating a havoc actually within consciousness. Social consciousness, there's also individual consciousness. And people don't really know how to mobilize, how to connect with each other. We see it also within families, within relationships of people, of friends, of lovers. We see constant battle because of all this information overflow. Do you think that your people assemblies can actually counterbalance this trend of mass media, of social media, of television, this constant bombardment of consciousness with irrelevant information?
Yes, well, it's important to frame our questions in a particular time and space, which is the present time of space, which is me talking to you on a Monday in February in 2024. In other words, what left-wing social analysis does an analysis outside time and space. It says the people of Greece are bombarded with social media, like you said, and they cannot get over it. And what that does is it creates a self-sabotaging social determinism, because what left-wing analysis does is basically provides reasons why it's difficult to rebel as an unintended consequence of doing social criticism. The revolutionary methodology is not left-wing social criticism. The revolutionary methodology is rooted in the present moment and the present space. So what I'd want you to do is to reframe your question, which is, what can me and you do to speak to the people who are listening to this podcast to decide what they're going to do next week? That's a very different question. But by framing the question like that, we undeniably give ourselves agency. If we do top-level social criticism, we find ourselves enmeshed in a deterministic construction, which by definition is not changeable, right? So we have to say, okay, what are you going to do next Wednesday? You know you can control that question, right? You can go to the shops, or you can do a seminar for people on this podcast about why don't we create a movement in Greece. So this is the work I do, and this is why I've helped to be responsible for some of the biggest social movements in the Western world. Because when I go to talk to a group, I don't say, well, you Germans, you've got all these terrible problems. There's this, there's that. This, constrains you. It's very difficult to mobilize. Like, that's all interesting, but has no relevance to the project of social transformation. What we have to focus on is, there's 5 people in the room. What are you going to do next Wednesday? So, for instance, as you may know, Last Generation is one of the biggest social movements in Europe. It's done thousands of public meetings. It's done thousands of direct actions in Germany. 90% of the people in Germany know about it. I know for a fact that it started off with 4 or 5 people in a room with me. And I said to them, what are you going to do next Wednesday? That's step 1. What are you going to do the Wednesday after? That's step 2. And what I'm saying to you and to your audience is, if you're going to be responsible for the social transformation that's going to save humanity, then you have to focus on the here and now. And the next step after this podcast is to have another podcast to discuss creating a movement in Greece. And that doesn't mean, oh, it's really difficult to create a movement in Greece because people are busy, they don't want to meet together, bum, right? What we go is saying, okay, we've got 50 people on the call. Who lives in Athens? Okay, there's 5 guys live in Athens. Okay, who do you know? Okay, I know 10 people. Oh, you know 10 people. Okay, who's got a venue? Okay, let's tell everyone to come to that venue, create a screen and put Roger Hallam on it and someone from Last Generation. And then we will tell you the next steps. Can you do that for me? Yes. You see what I mean?
Yes. Make it concrete, make it specific, put a time frame. This is the way to organize any campaign, actually. Take it from the micro level to the macro level.
Yes. But again, you're generalizing about what I'm saying. What I'm saying to you, is it Alex? Can I call you Alex?
Yeah, sure. Alex.
What I'm saying, Alex, is your responsibility, or I'm challenging you, that your responsibility is not to generalize what I'm saying, but to actualize it. So to say to your podcast listeners, look, this is great. It's lovely to talk about these social dynamics, but that is not responsible behavior. What we have to do is to get another live stream with Roger Hallam, with 50 of us on the call, and maybe 1 or 2 other people, and discuss what we're going to do in the next month. And that doesn't mean that you personally, Alex, are going to lead the revolution or anything, right? All you're doing is being an embedded intellectual. And this is Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual. You understand this, right? Which is the intellectual should not stand outside the social struggle. The intellectual needs to be embedded. The intellectual needs to be in prison, right? In order for that person to have credibility with ordinary people in their struggle, they need to be in the factory. In other words, it's not wrong that you do the podcast, right? That's your role as an intellectual. But your podcast has to be embedded in the process of mobilization. So what I'm suggesting to you concretely, because I've got to go in a minute, is you send me an email, you send out something to all your wonderful people, and you say, we're going to have another podcast with Roger, or a live show on Zoom rather, and people can come on Zoom and we have a translator and blah, 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 whatever we need. And we say, okay, Roger will show us the next step, right? That's all people need to know. So I've got to go in a minute, but because I've got a big meeting, but I just want to thank you so much, Alex, for inviting me. And I'm so excited about talking to someone in Greece, because I'm sure Greece is waiting to be mobilized, right?
Roger, thank you very much for your time. I know you have a meeting, you have a strategy meeting. Is it with Just Stop Oil, or is it with
yeah, Just Stop Oil.
Extinction Rebellion? Just Stop Oil.
Yeah. But thank you so much, and thanks everyone.
Thank you for your time. We keep in touch. We keep. I'll be happy to have you again whenever you find the time. Actually.
Yeah. We'll get that soon.
Coordinate.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.